Big football news today could impact the Eagles. John McMullen all over it, 97.3 ESPN.com. We'll get his take on the Boardwalk on the hotline as the NFL, oddly, on a beautiful spring day, the Jets have fired their general manager. Okay, what is the origin of this? Why? Why now? And what are the repercussions? What are the domino effects? And how could it end up affecting the Eagles as the Jets have fired their GM, Mike McCagan, and Adam Gase will have the final say for now. He's like Brett Brown. He's kind of like the interim GM until they figure out what they want to do. But what they want to do could affect the Philadelphia Eagles. Let's get into that more. John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN. I had done all this research for stuff I wanted to talk about, from some football stuff with the Eagles and some offense stuff. And then this happens. We always talk about the NFL. There's always something. And this move here, it's a beautiful day out, John. Who got ticked off so much on such a beautiful day that they fired the general manager of the Jets today?
Well, I think that, first of all, I think that's the worst thing you've ever said about Brett Brown, comparing him to Adam Gase. That's an insult.
Well, he's the head coach, and then all of a sudden he's
I know what you're saying, but just making a little quip because I don't have a ton of respect for Adam Gase, and he won a coup. So you have to ask yourself what the Jets ownership is doing there to allow a two-time failed coach to have the keys to everything. And from the Eagles' perspective, I've already been texting with some people. Joe and Adam like each other from the time they spent in Chicago together. And that's the guy Adam Gase wants to be the GM of the Jets. So ultimately, I think it's going to happen. The only thing I think that could derail it is Gase's ego. Maybe if he asks for too much power, Joe will say, hey, I'm going to have some options after the season, and maybe he'll hold off. But there's only 32 of these jobs, and I know for a fact Joe has told me personally he wants to be a GM in this league, and the Jets have some talent on that team. So it's not as bad a situation from a talent perspective as people think.
Yeah, no, they went out and got Le'Veon Bell. They added, obviously, Sam Darnold last year. They obviously have some young personnel on that side of the ball that people are excited about. But Joe Douglas obviously is the name in Philadelphia that a lot of people are mentioning. I saw that you mentioned that and tweeted. League source says Joe Douglas is indeed Adam Gase's, preference to be the GM. We heard Daniel Jeremiah's name has been thrown out there as well. But Douglas is going to leave whether it's now or in the future. What are some of the things that the Eagles have done, and are they prepared, and how much of a loss would it be at this stage of where we are in the offseason entering a season?
Well, I don't think it would be that big of a loss at this stage because you've gone through the draft. It's a big loss. I don't want to downplay it because this guy has been a significant part of the Eagles personnel department, the biggest part of it, and it's been really good since he got here. And it is going to be difficult to replace him. But the Eagles have been preparing for this. Back in February, I told you when they hired Andrew Berry, the Eagles spun it in a different way and said it's just adding talent to the front office. But I said at the time, no, they're preparing for Joe's inevitable exit because it was going to happen, and it is going to happen. Even if it doesn't happen right now, he's a hot commodity in this league, and he's going to be a GM, and he's blocked here. So it's just one of those situations. And Jeffrey Lurie mentioned that at the league meetings. He said when you're good and you're successful, you're going to lose executives. That's just part of it. Same as losing assistant coaches, which we've already seen from Doug Peterson's staff.
Why would the Jets do it like now? Why today? Why not before the draft? It just seems so odd.
Well, it's very odd to fire a GM at this part of the year. You see a lot of personnel department moves after the draft because Those people are on different contract schedules, and they go basically from draft to draft. So that's the movement for lower level guys in personnel departments around the league. This is the time of year you see that moves. But GMs are sort of on the same schedule as coaches, and that's visited after the season. And generally, if you're going to fire your GM, you're going to fire it in January. And it's very rare to happen this time of year. And that's why people look at the Jets and call them a laughing stock or a clown show, and because you don't do business like this. But that's the Jets.
So what led to this? Is it a disagreement on some front? I mean, like you said, this is odd timing. Were there some dominoes that led to this? Because, again, like we said, this does have somewhat of an effect on potentially the Eagles front office moving forward here. So how did we get to this spot that the Jets decided to make this, odd move, at the timing-wise odd move?
Well, it was sort of their version of Chip Kelly versus Howie Roseman. And that's what it was. And Adam Gase didn't get along with Mike Maccagnan, and he's newer, and he garnered more power somehow, even though the resume doesn't deserve it, and he won the coup. That's what it comes down to. And it's always difficult, and you're not going to be successful in this league unless your GM and head coach is on the same page. So the theory from the Jets moving forward, they'll take their hits, but if they can get somebody like Joe Douglas who gets along with Adam and they can work together in the long term, that'll be much better for the organization. And it will. But you do look bad when you do this stuff the way they did it.
John McMullen at JF McMullen. Now, so you're saying that Gase essentially, sounds like anyway, did not like the money they spent on Le'Veon Bell and maybe others?
Yeah, did not like the money they spent on Le'Veon Bell or C.J. Mosley. He's probably right. If you look at the way teams generally allocate salary cap assets in this league, you generally don't pay that much money to running backs or middle linebackers. But those are sort of two of your core guys now. Once the deal is done, so to speak, and once they're in the organization, I don't know how much good it does to alienate them. Now he's got some repairing to do with relationships with guys who haven't even played a game and are arguably, two of the five best players on the Jets. You got the head coach.
How does Adam Gase have the audacity or the power to fire a guy or get a guy fired who essentially hired him?
Well, it's amazing. Well, and I think it tells you a couple things. Mike didn't hire him, Mike Maccagnan. That's an ownership. That's a Christopher Johnson deal. That's pretty evident, number one. So you kind of know when that situation unveils itself, it's not going to be successful, because what I just spoke of. If you don't have the GM and coach on the same page, it's ultimately going to fail. So this was always doomed to failure. But, you just look at Adam Gase and his history, and the Eagles dodged a bullet because they wanted him to be the head coach of this team before he chose Miami over them. You look at what he did in Miami. You think about Jay Ajayi for people in Philadelphia, and about how he threw him under the bus in Miami as he was out the door. He's really bad managing personalities, and that's a big part of the coaching profession.
Yeah, one would wonder if the new GM comes in. I mean, maybe that's why he's fighting for a guy like Joe Douglas, because maybe the next GM that comes in isn't all that enthralled with him being the head coach.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of that give and take, and generally you want a GM to hire a coach. I mean, that's the traditional setup in this league. And there are different ones. There are coaches who garner power, Bill Belichick being the most obvious example, who's been able to do it and be a great success. But even people like that, they acknowledge they have to delegate. I would argue that, Chip Kelly's biggest problem was not trusting people, not being able to delegate, and the job became overwhelming to him because you can't do personnel and coaching.
Yeah.
You just can't do it. You got to trust other people. He was never able to get the people he could trust, and that's what doomed him here. And I think you're already seeing Adam Gase make the same kind of mistakes, and he hasn't even coached a game for the Jets. Now, maybe that all turns if he gets his friend Joe Douglas in there.
Well, here's a question. If Gase, he's the GM right now, right? So essentially he's hiring his own replacement?
Well, I mean, the owner's always involved. So Woody Johnson stepped aside. It's now his son.
Right, because you would think John, a GM that was an actual GM, essentially would come in and be like, I don't want this guy to be the coach.
Well, yeah, and there's a good reason why he wants Joe, and they have a relationship, because then you do have that dynamic. If you go out and get, for instance, a proven general manager or somebody with a big name.
Can the Eagles deny permission to interview Douglas at this stage?
That's a good question. I do not believe they can.
I thought I read that somewhere that the Eagles could deny permission to interview Douglas because he's the VP of player personnel, and I don't know if that has anything to do with titles or something like that, but yeah.
Well, no, it has to do with his contract. And if you remember last year, the Eagles did prevent him for interviewing to be the GM of the Texans. And then if you go back to the extension for Doug Peterson and Howie Roseman, which was last summer, and noticeably absent from those extensions was Joe Douglas. We talked about it at the time. It was obvious, not that the Eagles don't like him, but Joe wants to be able to interview. Joe, as I said, has told me personally he wants to be a GM. So it's really difficult trying to find out when these personnel contracts end. I believe his ended after the draft. Now, he still works with the team. So it could have rolled over. They could have the ability to prevent him. I do not think they would, but it all has to unfold.
Yeah, I know that's interesting. That's something to kind of keep an eye on. Joe Douglas, and then, of course, you mentioned Daniel. I mentioned Daniel Jeremiah that came from Schefter, that he would be hired from the television. He's at the NFL Network right now. So Gase obviously is in a spot where he's trying to find someone he has some sort of relationship with. But, I mean, what an interesting situation that this guy has put himself. I mean, that's a bold strategy to get rid of the guy who, I guess,
it's a bold strategy, Cotton.
No question about it. I mean, I am like, when I saw that, I'm like, did this guy really, and you're right, the whole Chip Kelly thing kind of comes into play here. But the Le'Veon Bell, as you mentioned, was kind of the point of contention here that my question is, how did this fight not happen before? The owner would have to have agreed with the GM to sign and approve the deal, though. That's what makes it so bizarre to me.
Yeah, well, obviously they did, and the GM was certainly on.
So how did that's what I'm saying. How did if the owner agreed with the GM to sign the deal, how does he then backtrack and fire the guy when he agreed with him originally?
Well, people change their mind all the time. That's number one. Anybody who's worked in an office in any environment understands office politics. Number two, if you have somebody undercutting somebody else, and we can harken back to Chip and Howie, and Chip constantly, peppering Howie's not a football guy. Howie's not a football guy. I need guys I want. Sometimes it works. Sometimes you convince people. There's never going to be a better example than right here, because Jeff Lurie doesn't trust anybody more than Howie Roseman.
And then how does –
and he still was able to be convinced. for a short period of time. So, I mean, it's not like it's the first time it's happened. You have a lot of power struggles, not only in the NFL, but professional sports as a whole. There's always a winner and a loser. Howie's had his own. That he's won most of them. In fact, the only one he lost was with Chip Kelly.
Yeah, I have a hard time believing he's going to lose another battle ever again with a Super Bowl trophy. Right?
No, he's in good shape right now.
Right.
And that's part of the reason. I mean, again, this has nothing to do from the Eagles' standpoint. They would love to keep Joe Douglas. They want Joe Douglas. They want him here in perpetuity, but he's never going to get the GM job here. So they ultimately know they're going to lose him, whether now or later.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way, or is there any way is there a position above Roseman that Roseman would get out of player personnel, or is that something that he wants to remain in and continue doing? Like, is there somebody above Roseman that you would promote him and say, Douglas, you're so valuable, we're going to promote Roseman and give you that position?
Well, because it's not about the title. It's not about the position. It's about the power. And that's Howie's first love is personnel.
Okay, so that's what I'm saying. Forget the titles. I'm just saying, like, is there a position above player personnel being involved in picking players and putting the roster together that is more that Roseman would want to be? We all want to try to get to a spot where we get promoted. Is there another position above Roseman that he yearns to get to?
You could put him as team president, which is Don Smolensky right now. But first of all, they like Don. That's not going to happen. And I don't think Howie would be interested in that role because his love and what he was trying and why he was so upset when he lost the power struggle is the personnel part of the game.
Okay.
And he wants to be a de facto GM, and he's obviously done a phenomenal job. He's not going anywhere.
He's a young
Joe
guy.
Can only go so far.
I mean, how old's Howie? 47?
Yeah, he's young. So that part of it as well. It's just the nature. It's just like, Frank Reich leaving as offensive coordinator. He's not going to be the head coach here. So you got to leave to advance, and same position Joe Douglas is in.
Yeah, John, it's got to be an awkward situation, too, with Le'Veon Bell that, there's some reports out there that Gase didn't want Bell at all.
Yeah, and that's the part that's most surprising to me. And
not even like, I don't want you at that price. I don't want you, period.
Yeah. Again, because I say that, look, you can believe that, and you can have a different opinion than the GM and say you'd rather go in a different direction at running back or middle linebacker with C.J. Mosley. You can believe that, but why go public with it? Why let that information out when the guys are already signed and now they're core parts of your team? That's the most surprising part of all of this to me. I get the power struggle. I get the coup. That kind of stuff happens all the time, but it's just silly. Your talent acquisition season, as Howie likes to call it, is ending. You've already put together your team. There'll be a little tweaks everywhere, barring injuries and a couple of veteran guys who still have to shake out and sign. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, the heavy lifting from that aspect is done. So they're your guys now. Why are you angering them? Now you have to repair relationships with your players. And I think anybody who saw Adam Gase in his first two stops, that would be the first criticism, the fact that he doesn't get along with anybody. Right. And this is a perfect example of why.
How much, I don't know if they want to do a percentage, or how much impact or value do you place on Douglas being here and what he has meant to the Super Bowl team? And to where they are today? I mean, a lot of people credit him for guys like Alshon Jeffrey, Jordan Howard, finding these, secondary type players, guys that he had contacts with, Jernigan, By the way, what's going on with Jernigan? People keep texting me asking you about what's going on with Jernigan. Did he post something that was kind of weird?
Yeah, he posted something on Instagram.
See, I'm not a big IG guy, so I wouldn't have seen that.
And it was after Telvin Smith walked away in Jacksonville, and it was kind of cryptic. And he said maybe he'll do what Telvin does if he doesn't get respect, and shaking his head. But we'll get to see Tim hopefully at OTAs next week, and maybe could have been something personal. So I until I talk to him, I have no idea. I can't give it much credence, but because he mentioned Telvin, people assume he meant walking away from the game, and we'll see if that's what he meant.
After he just signed,
it
doesn't make a lot of sense.
It was very clear.
Right? I mean, he just signed 2 weeks ago. It doesn't make a lot of sense he would sign and then walk away.
Well, remember what he's gone through. He had that huge deal, and then he hurt himself off the field, had to have cervical fusion surgery. His very career was threatened. He had to sign for much less money. So there's a chance he's upset, and there's a chance he woke up one day and saw what Telvin Smith did and said, you know what? Why am I breaking my you-know-what for this organization who cut my salary, didn't stand by me in my moment of need, so to speak? That's a possibility, but until you talk to the player, you really can't speculate on some social media postings. We know people post some crazy stuff at times.
So back to the first question about Douglas. I mean, how much value do you place on what he has helped? You know, we give Howie a lot of credit, but there is that contingent of people who just can't bring themselves to give Roseman the credit, and they think that it is.
You know why? Because Chip Kelly. Not a football guy.
Right. Well, yes, and there's a lot of people who, regardless, it's the way he talks, the way he looks, or whatever. There's a lot of people who just
the nerd.
Yes, there's a lot of people that just can't bring themselves to give him the credit and give the credit to Douglas. So how much credit should Douglas get for guys like Jernigan, guys like Nata, guys like Jeffries, guys like Jordan Howard?
Well, and this is always Joe is a big part of this organization. Joe builds the draft board. Joe's in charge of the personnel department. Joe does all the heavy lifting. But I think a lot of people look at other GMs and say, for whatever reason, because of some of those issues I said with Howie, and they don't give Howie Roseman credit. Look, every GM in this league has a staff, and you rely on that staff. And it goes farther and deeper than Joe Douglas. I mean, one of the issues is if you lose Joe Douglas, are you going to lose Andy Weidel? Are you going to lose Casey Weidel? Are you going to lose other people in the personnel department as well? We'll see how all of that shakes out. But they all work as one. They're all part of the same personnel department. And Howie Roseman's in charge of the personnel department. So he's the one who gets blamed when things go wrong. He's the one who should get credit when things go right. Joe's a big part of it, but this is Howie Roseman's personnel department, and Howie's the one who hired him.
Yeah, by the way, Adam Kaplan just tweeted this out. He has spoken to potential GM candidates who have mentioned having control would be an issue, and keep in mind a team could block a candidate from leaving if it's not a real GM job. I don't know how they could prove that.
Well, final control of 53-man roster.
But how do you – the Jets could say he has final say and then not –
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's it. That's all they have to do. They say it, and you can't block them. But that's why we talk about titles all the time. They're not necessarily – the important part is the power. And the de facto general manager job in this league traditionally has control over the 53-man roster. I believe if the Jets offer that, the Eagles, they might be able to block him. Like I said, if his contract rolled over, I don't think they would block him, to be honest.
All right.
They got Andrew Berry in here for a reason, and that's the heir apparent for Joe Douglas.
That's a very interesting story today. John has more at JF McMullen. And by the way, if you're a wrestling fan, you got to follow him today on this AEW announcement. All right?
Yeah, no rights fees. How many times am I right about these TV deals, Mike?
You should get a media column. We should do a media podcast.
Yeah, we should.
At JF
Get on
McMullen.
it.
Well, we got to carve out some time. There's just never any time. We'll talk tomorrow, man.
All right, bud.
Hey, you will proceed CM Punk tomorrow.
All right, CM Punk.
Yeah,
he's coming back to AEW.
I am definitely going to ask him.
He's gaining weight.
Friday night, I will ask him that. All right.
All right.